Welcome, everybody. Welcome to our discussion today with Professor Serhii Plokhy on Russia's war on Ukraine, the return of the empire and the nuclear threats. I'm Ed Schatz, Director of the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies here at the Monk School, the University of Toronto, and on behalf of CERES and the Petro Yatzik Program for the Study of Ukraine, we're truly honored to have such an esteemed guest who is perhaps the world's leading historian of Ukraine. Before I introduce Professor Plokhy, let me take a moment to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. As most of you will know, for thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are indeed grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Professor Serhii Plokhy is Mikhailo Khrushchevsky Professor of Ukrainian History and Director of the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard University, where he has been since 2007. Before that, he taught at the University of Dnipropetrovsk, which is now Dnipro, right? And at the University of Alberta. But before I continue, allow me a brief aside. I was reading this morning about a scientific study that concerned exercise and longevity. And the finding was that people who achieve what the study calls breathlessness, that is, they have difficulty speaking while exercising, live longer. Well, covering Serhii Plokhy's accomplishments will certainly prolong your life. By my count, Professor Plokhy has published 16 books in English, including, okay, deep breath, here goes. The Cossacks and Religion in Early Modern Ukraine, Oxford University Press, 2002. Tsars and Cossacks, Study in Iconography, Ukrainian Research Institute, 2003. With Frank Sisson, Religion and Nation in Modern Ukraine, Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, 2003. Unmaking Imperial Russia, Toronto, 2005. The Origin of the Slavic Nations, Cambridge, 2006. Ukraine and Russia, Toronto, 2008. Yalta, The Price of Peace, Viking, 2010. The Cossack Myth, History and Nationhood in the Age of Empires, again, Cambridge, 2012. The Last Empire, Final Days of the Soviet Union, this one by Basic Books, 2014, which won the Gelber Prize, which is, I think you were in this room, right? 7 years ago for that award ceremony. The Gates of Europe, History of Ukraine, Basic Books, 2015. Lost Kingdom, Quest for Empire and the Making of the Russian Nation, Basic Books, 2017. Chernobyl, A History of Tragedy, Alan Lane, 2018, Forgotten Bastards of the Eastern Front, Oxford, 2019, Nuclear Folly, History of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Norton, 2021. The Frontline Essays on Ukraine's Past and Present, Ukrainian Research Institute, 2021, and, breathless, Atoms and Ashes, A Global History of Nuclear Disaster, New York, Norton and Company, 2022. And Professor Plokhy will be available to sign some books outside, and they're available, I believe, for sale, right? Outside after our talk today. A great friend of Ukraine, of Canada, of CERES, and of the Monk School, but most of all, an historian who is truly world-class. Serhii, we're delighted to welcome you back to Toronto. We wish it were under entirely different circumstances, but we look forward to hearing from you and learning from you on this important topic. Professor Plokhy will have the floor for 45 minutes, whatever you see fit. And then our own Professor Robert Austin, which is Robert's over there on the side, will, who is himself an eminent historian of Central and Southeast Europe, will moderate questions from the audience here in the room and at home. Professor Plokhy.
Well, thanks a lot for this wonderful and warm introduction. I'm really happy to be back in Toronto and see old friends and hopefully make new ones as well. When Professor Austin suggested this visit and this talk, I was trying to put together, again, the topic was one of the discussions. It was very clear. We met already, it was second or third month of the war. That war is something that on everybody's mind. And I believe that we historians, we can provide some perspective on that war and some understanding of that war that otherwise was missing or is missing today. But then there was another theme that was quite new, at least when you look at the history of the disintegration of the empires, formation of the modern nation states. That issue was nuclear. And the return of the empire and the nuclear threats are the two things that are linked together, brought together in the title of today's presentation. But it is also, in my opinion, this is something that really very much defines the key features, the key characteristics of what is happening today in Ukraine. Back in the year 2000, a prominent historian of the Soviet Union and of Russia, Stephen Kotkin, published a book which was called Armageddon Averted. And the point of the title, at least, if not the book as a whole, was that the Cold War ended with the disintegration of the Soviet Union and didn't end with the nuclear war. So that was the premises of the title, that was the premises of the approach as such. And one thing that we see today is first that the fall of the Soviet Union is not an event. It didn't end with Mikhail Gorbachev's speech on December 25th, 1991. The process of the disintegration of the Soviet Union and post-Soviet space in many ways only started at that time and that point. And that the Armageddon was not entirely averted, but maybe postponed, because what we see today is return not only the story and the history that started in 1991 or even earlier, as I will try to show, but also the return of the nuclear threat that wasn't with us for more than 30 years. And Ukraine is at the middle, at the intersection of these two processes. The old and traditional one associated with the disintegration of the empires, the wars for independence, the story that begins at least since the American Revolution, and these processes, the processes of the fight for independence, are happening now in the nuclear world, the world that is relatively new, at least from the perspective of a historian. So let me see now whether I can master the PowerPoint. I can move it on my screen, but I can't do that on your screen. And I wonder whether all the connections are in place or not, because I have a couple of images that, okay, that's, now we got it here. Okay, wonderful, thank you. Again, when we talked and discussed the topic and the time, we couldn't predict that the nuclear threats would become so explicit as it happened only a few days ago. When Vladimir Putin did in one speech 3 things at the same time. First, he declared so-called limited the mobilization, which again, most of the observers believe that this is a mobilization that will be not limited in any way, and not 300,000 people, but probably million or maybe more than 1 million. The second thing that was done was that he suggested that the so-called referendums that they are preparing on the territory of the occupied parts of Ukraine would not only go ahead, but would be recognized as legitimate referendums by the Russian Federation. And the third thing that he did, he threatened the West, and he threatened more specifically Ukraine with the use of the nuclear weapons. And here we are really in a different place, because the former imperial power suggests that it can go and occupy parts of other countries, the former parts of the colonies or peripheries of the empires, declare them to be part of that former empire, and then use nuclear weapons against any country that challenges that new reality, in violation, of course, of all international agreements, including the agreements, Budapest Memorandums and others, in which the use of the nuclear weapons by a nuclear power against non-nuclear power, or even threat of by the use of the nuclear weapons is prohibited. The disintegration of the Soviet Union, which is closely related to the Ukrainian independence, and the process that was in many ways triggered and started as the result of the Ukrainian drive for independence, came at the end of the Cold War, and in the Cold War and in the arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. But there was also another very important nuclear theme and very important nuclear topic in the story of the disintegration of the USSR and of the Cold War and the rise of independent Ukraine. That part of the story was called Chernobyl. And the story of Chernobyl is extremely important, not only for the course of the Cold War, in which it has been claimed, at least by Mikhail Gorbachev himself, that he rethought his thinking about the nuclear war, asking whether the Soviet Union could actually survive a nuclear attack if the accident at Chernobyl turned out to be so dramatic of events, so difficult to deal with. The consequences were so lasting and so devastating for the Soviet economy. But there was another even more important consequences of Chernobyl, and this is the fact that Chernobyl really brought to the fore the movement in Ukraine, but also in other Soviet republics, in particular in the Republic of Lithuania, against the center, against the Soviet center. The Lithuanian movement for independence, the organization, which was called Sąjūdis, was born out of mobilization against the nuclear power after Chernobyl. 20,000 people surrounded the Ignalina nuclear power plant, the power plant that probably is known to the majority of you because of the HBO miniseries. That's where they were shooting the film about Chernobyl. It was twin sister power station in Ignalina to the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. And in Ukraine itself, the first mass manifestation in Ukraine, in Kyiv in particular, that took place in 1988, over 10,000 people, was over the issue of Chernobyl and nuclear power. And the Ruch, the movement for independence of Ukraine, comes out of that mobilization a few months after this mass manifestation. And if you look at what Vyacheslav Chernobyl and other leaders of the Ruch were saying at that time, what they were writing at that time, they were acknowledging the direct link and direct connection between the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, the accident there, and the rise of anti-nuclear and pro-independence movement in Ukraine. Chernobyl reactor was a very particular type of reactor. It was a so-called dual-purpose reactor, which means that it could be used for boiling water and producing electricity, but it also could be switched and used for the production of plutonium. That was one of the reasons why the regime of secrecy surrounded what was happening at Chernobyl. And Chernobyl, in that sense, is really, really a symbol where the so-called atoms for peace and atoms for war come together. They came together in the place called Chernobyl. And in that sense, the role of Chernobyl in mobilization Ukrainian independence, the role of Ukrainian independence in the end of the Soviet Union and in the end of the Cold War is really difficult to overestimate. This is a photo from or image from the HBO miniseries about, of course, Soviet media completely being silent about what was happening at Chernobyl. And this is the image of Ukrainians celebrating their independence in August of 1991. Now, the Chernobyl accident had a major impact on Ukrainian thinking about not only independence, but also about the sort of a country that Ukrainians were building in the early 1990s. The Chernobyl suggested to many Ukrainian politicians at that time that nuclear energy in its all manifestations, from the nuclear power stations to the nuclear bombs, was basically an evil force, something that Ukraine didn't want to be associated with. The original idea was that Ukraine would have to give up, first of all, on the nuclear energy. The parliament accepted a moratorium on the construction of the new nuclear power plants. And the idea was to phase out nuclear energy altogether. And another idea was that Ukraine should become a non-nuclear state. And the reason for that was also that if Ukraine would insist on continuing to be a nuclear state, that would make it much more difficult for the country to acquire independence, and more specifically to acquire the international recognition for that independence. So let's leave nuclear energy behind, let's leave nuclear weapons behind, and let's move toward our independence. That would be easier to achieve. And that was pretty much the Ukrainian position up until the dissolution of the Soviet Union, 1 week after the Ukrainian referendum on December 1st, 1991. The agreement that was signed and the understanding that was achieved at Belovezha in December of 1991 was first that the three republics, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, that were most affected by the fallout of Chernobyl, would work together dealing with the consequences of the disaster. And the third one was that Ukraine and Belarus would give up their nuclear weapons. That was the message that was delivered by President Yeltsin of Russia when he was calling the US President George H.W. Bush from Vyskuly, from Belarus at that time. Ukraine at that time starts rethinking its relation to the nuclear weapons. And the key reason for that was the worsening relations with Russia. Because the model that the new denuclearization acquires in 1991 and 1992 was that the United States preferred to deal with the evil they knew, or the devil they knew, with Moscow. So the idea was that all Soviet nukes from Kazakhstan, from Ukraine, from Belarus would be moved to Russia. Not removed from those countries and go to third countries. They would be removed to Russia. And the position that eventually President Kravchuk and people around him take, that we actually can't do that. In the conditions where Russia starts making claims on the Ukrainian territory, and the first of those claims was already very soon after the coup in Moscow in 1991, in late August of that year, when the spokesperson for President Yeltsin, Pavel Vashchanov, said that if Ukraine decides to leave the Soviet Union, Russia has the right to raise issue of the borders. And when he was asked what borders, what did he have in mind, Crimea and Donbass were specifically mentioned. That was August of 1991. By May of 1992, there is a big issue going on over the Navy, over the Black Sea Fleet. Who has the right for Black Sea Fleet? And the issue of the Crimea is raised also as the as the major problem in relations between Russia and Ukraine by no less a figure than at that time Vice President of the Russian Federation, General Rutskoy, who in late April of 1992 makes public statements claiming Ukrainian sovereignty over its territory and Crimea in particular. This is May of 1992, exactly the time when the United States forces Ukraine to sign non-proliferation, to join the non-proliferation treaty as a non-nuclear state. So Ukraine is forced to give up its nuclear weapons, not at some point in time where it doesn't have any threat. It is forced to do that at the moment when Russia advances its territorial claims on the Ukrainian territory. Which means that Ukraine tries to resist. And the best what Ukrainians were able to get at that time was first the compensation, financial compensation for the nuclear weapons that they were giving up. And second, after they stopped moving their nukes to Russia, saying that they were not going to do that, given that it makes Russia stronger and its claims on Ukrainian territory more credible, the idea was that the Ukrainians were allowed to accompany those nukes to Russia and see and oversee the process of the destruction and conversion of the plutonium and uranium into a form of the fuel that can be used in the nuclear power stations. Budapest Memorandum became at the end the final document that was signed already, not by Kravchuk, but was signed by Kuchma, where Ukraine and other post-Soviet countries like Kazakhstan, like Belarus, received not guarantees, but assurances of their territorial integrity and sovereignty. The world moved on. The problem, the threat that was posed by allegedly loose nukes on the territory of the Soviet Union, of former territory of the Soviet Union, was allegedly resolved. Just a second. Now, what the Budapest Memorandum really did. The Budapest Memorandum created a security vacuum in the center of Europe. So by removing a deterrence in nuclear weapons from the country on whose territories claims were made by the neighboring country, by the nuclear power, it created this security vacuum. It made Ukraine vulnerable to a degree that it was not vulnerable before 1994. And the problem was that no substitute was really provided in terms of the assurance security of the country and the region. So the one way to think about the Budapest Memorandum is to imagine the security system in Europe in general as a brick wall. Then someone comes and actually punches a huge hole in that wall by removing the nuclear weapons from Ukraine. And then you put over that wall a wallpaper called Budapest Memorandum and declare that everything is okay, that the wall is there, it continues, it performs its function. Now, what could have been done, what else could go into that wall if, let's say, the nuclear weapons were removed from Ukrainian territory? What would be the substitute? What would still protect Ukraine under the circumstances? Well, the answer was provided by the Polish politicians in 1990 and 1991. When they told the visiting American officials from the State Department, saying that first, we want to be members of NATO. If we are not members of NATO, we would have to look for the alternative ways of protecting our sovereignty. We would have to start developing nuclear program of our own. So from the perspective of at least part of the Polish political establishment in the 1990s and the early 1990s, the security guarantees were coming either with the membership in NATO, and that's where Poland eventually joined NATO, or with the control over and possession of the nuclear weapons. So in Ukraine, the nuclear weapons were removed. The NATO moved to the Ukrainian borders and stopped there. The worst thing that could happen at that time happened at the Bucharest Memorandum in the year 2008. When Ukraine was under President Yushchenko at that time, it was suggested that Ukraine can actually apply for NATO at that summit. But then the summit had a discussion and under pressure of Russia turned down that request. So Ukraine publicly in front of Russia and everyone else manifested its desire to join NATO. And the NATO publicly in front of everyone else said that Ukraine is not joining NATO at some point in the future, but not now. So joining NATO at that time was already perceived by Putin as a direct threat to Russia. And rejection of Ukraine as a potential member of NATO meant that Ukraine was left completely exposed to the threat or to the potential war. A few months after the Bucharest summit of 2008, Putin starts a military campaign, a war against Georgia, another country that had the same aspirations as Ukraine. So immediate response to the Bucharest summit, to the failed attempt and public declaration of the intentions of joining NATO, and public rejection on the part of NATO of these aspirations. So the war in Ukraine that comes in 2014 and then becomes all-out war. Earlier this year, in February of 2022, at least in this reading, has two narratives and has two frames and trends that result eventually in that conflict. First, something that I started with, that was the story of the disintegration of the Soviet Union or disintegration of the Soviet Empire. And the second one was the nuclear story, the story of Chernobyl, and then the story of disarmament of Ukraine. The story of the fall of the Soviet Union acquired a new dimension, I would say, with the publication by President Putin in July of the last year, the article on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, where the goals of the Russian foreign policy, its attitude toward Ukraine, and eventually foundation, legitimation, but also foundation for the thinking about the future war, was presented in the imperial terms. Because what Putin did, he went back to the writings of the Russian political thinkers and philosophers and historians and writers of the imperial Russia pre-1917, borrowing from there the idea of the existence of one big Russian nation where Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians are one and the same, and used that theory, that concept, that idea as, again, as I said, legitimation for the war that was coming, but also the foundation for his own thinking about what the relations between Russia and Ukraine should be. It is on the basis of that misreading of history is that the plans for the war in Ukraine, The idea is that Kyiv would fall within the few days or within 1 week, that the Ukrainians would welcome Russians as liberators was based. So it wasn't just a smokescreen, it wasn't just a legitimation tool, it was also a manifestation of Putin's own thinking, which really puts our story, the story of this war, not only in the context of the collapse of the Soviet Union, but puts it into the context of the long durée process of the collapse of the Russian Empire that starts in 1917 or starts in the middle of World War I and continues till today. Again, the new dimension has been nuclear. Now, the war in Ukraine, the all-out war that started on February 24th of this year, went nuclear already on its very first day, when the Russian troops in, at that point, unmarked uniforms, so it was almost like it was a repetition of the Crimean scenario of March of 2014. So the troops in unmarked uniforms took over control over the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, the site, Chernobyl nuclear site. Why was that done? Again, something that no one really imagined that would happen. There is a number of explanations. One of them is, again, a very, very plausible one about the possibility of the nuclear blackmail. But another explanation is very simple. The Chernobyl zone, exclusion zone, was exactly on the way from the Russian troops that were at that time located in southern Belarus as part allegedly of maneuvers, and Kyiv, that became the key objective of the Russian operations in the first days and first weeks of the war. So the easiest way to get from Belarus for Russian troops was by marching through the Chernobyl nuclear exclusion zone, which then demonstrated actually complete disregard for safety and recklessness of the Russian army. Once the Russians were forced to leave northern Ukraine and Chernobyl zone, it turned out that they were digging trenches right on the border of the Red Forest. Again, everyone who watched HBO miniseries, apparently those soldiers didn't watch it, knew that you don't dig trenches in the Red Forest or next to it, because that will come certainly with a price. But one thing that changed immediately, and that was that the war for the first time in history came on the nuclear side. And the nuclear site was used as a battleground, or as the way through which the troops and equipment and so on and so forth could be transported to the front lines. The detectors, the nuclear detectors in the zone immediately registered and then reported the dramatic rise in the level of radiation. And it was not clear for the first few days what was going on. Then it turned out that the heavy equipment, the tanks and other things that the Russians were moving through the zone, they raised the dust, the radioactive dust from in the zone, increasing the level of radiation. So that was the first scare. The second one came when the power lines, the ones that were bringing electricity to the Chernobyl nuclear power plant from outside, were damaged. The functioning of the safe confinement over the fourth block of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant needed electricity to function properly. But more importantly, the last Chernobyl reactor, reactor number 3, that was shut down in the year 2000, the spent fuel assemblies from that reactor, They are still located on the territory of the Chernobyl, on the Chernobyl zone. In the cooling ponds, which need new water and fresh water to cool them down, to cool them all that, keep the temperature down. Otherwise, they get overheated, and that would produce another release of radiation. Now, this water is supplied by pumps. Pumps need electricity to work and to function. The Chernobyl nuclear plant is not there anymore. It can't produce electricity. You need electricity coming from outside. The actions, the military actions in the area cut off the lines, put in the staff which worked as a hostage on the territory of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. In extremely difficult situation, they had to use the backup generators that were working on diesel and so on and so forth. The Belarusians, the allies of Russians, got terrified and said that we'll provide our own lines and our own electricity to keep those pumps working. So it didn't. At the end, the Ukrainian crews were able to restore the supply of electricity from the outside of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, and the accident that was in the making didn't happen. But that was exactly the scenario that then would start to develop in southern Ukraine at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which is the largest nuclear power plant in Europe with 6 reactors. Again, at this point, those reactors don't work. They're all shut down. But the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant was taken over in early March as the result of a military attack, shelling of the nuclear power plant, and one of the buildings, the training center next to one of the reactors of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, catching fire. That was the situation where the first time really in history, the war was waged on the territory of the functioning nuclear power plant. We had situations not of that kind in the late 70s and early 80s, where the bombing of the reactors that were suspected of the production of the plutonium were taking place in the Middle East. The Israelis were bombing, the Iranians were bombing Iraqis, the Americans were bombing Iraqis, and so on and so forth. But those were the military reactors producing or suspected of producing plutonium. Those were not civil nuclear power plants. 2 cases there were in the history before Zaporizhzhia, where the nuclear power plants were taken over by the so-called guerrilla forces. One time it was in Latin America, another time it was in South Africa. In both cases, the reactors were still under construction. They were not working. So Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is the first time in history where the war is being waged on the territory of the nuclear power plant. The major concern for the possible accident at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is that the Chernobyl type of a situation can repeat itself. With all the reactors being shut down, the nuclear power plant needs outside energy, outside electricity, to keep the fuel within those reactors on a certain level in terms of the temperature. If the electricity is not there, you get a situation of Fukushima. So not of Chernobyl of 1986, but of Fukushima, because the explosion and radiation that was released at Fukushima, they are not linked to it's not a Chernobyl type of an accident where something went wrong with the operation of the reactor. The reactors were all shut down even before the tsunami wave hit the nuclear power plant. They were shut down as part of the standard procedure after the accident. But the tsunami destroyed the power lines that were bringing electricity outside electricity to the plant. The plant was not producing electricity anymore, and the reactors got overheated. So we had the similar type of a situation, or close to that, in Zaporizhia a few weeks ago, where because of the war actions and war activities in the region, the power was cut off. Another extremely important part of this dangerous situation that emerged in Zaporizhia and continues still today is the fact that the operators of the nuclear power plant are taken as hostages. Many people left the city of Enerhodar. Many people don't work at the nuclear power plant anymore. Those who are left really are exposed to the level of stress that is absolutely unacceptable in the nuclear industry. Chernobyl accident, or the accident at 3 Mile Island, or other nuclear accidents were happening without bombs being or the missiles exploding next to the reactors, without the men in the military uniforms with arms in their hands being present in the operational halls of the or rooms of the nuclear power plant. So that adds a lot of pressure, which means that people can make mistake, and that's another big issue. And the third one, directly linked to the war and the way how the Russian Federation conducts this war. This is, of course, all on the top of Bucha and Izum and other things of this demonstration of this barbaric way of fighting the war. But this nuclear barbarism and nuclear blackmail is certainly part of that bigger story. So the nuclear power plant built in the way that outsiders really can't get in. It's built in the way that it's the closest to the modern fortress that you can imagine in terms of the architecture of the enterprises or architecture of the cities or towns. So it is a very convenient location for the troops of any country, in this particular case of the Russian Federation, to get inside of the walls of the nuclear power plant and being protected by them. The idea that this is a nuclear power plant also protects them from the attacks and missile attacks and artillery attacks of the Ukrainian army. And what we see starting in July of this year, once the Ukrainians started to talk first and then making this build up and preparation for the counteroffensive in southern Ukraine, is that the Russian forces that were based at the nuclear power plant would leave its territory, fire missiles across the Dnieper River to the city of Nikopol and others, and then immediately get back to into the safety of the nuclear power plant. So what we know today, in July, Ukrainians started to use the drones to attack the Russian forces outside of the plant. And an appeal went on the social media to the Ukrainians in the region, asking them to find the way to inform the Ukrainian armed forces when the artillery and missile and other units were leaving the premises of the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, so that the Ukrainians could hear them outside of the plant. So one way or another, the plant found itself in the middle of the war zone. And the developments already in August and in early September demonstrate that there is a shelling of the nuclear power plant. President Zelensky stated more than once that he looks at that as a Russian blackmail. And the blackmail is about the future or the already happening counteroffensive of Ukrainian forces in the south. So Russia is trying to use the nuclear power plant the same way how it uses referendums or wants to use referendums to claim this territory, to force Ukrainians for a ceasefire where the territory that is now under Russian control would remain under the Russian control. And the blackmail addressed is not only to the Ukrainians. The blackmail certainly is addressed to the West, with the idea that if you keep and continue support Ukrainian arms effort and so on and so forth, you can get another Fukushima or another Chernobyl in the middle of Europe. Where does this leave the world? One thing, and you probably recognize, if you don't recognize, there is Rafael Grossi, the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, stands like a Star Wars character in front of the commissioner delegation that was going to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Well, the behavior of the Grossi and International Atomic Energy Agency is even half not as heroic as this image might suggest. For the first 10 days approximately, the International Atomic Energy Agency was issuing, after the takeover of Chernobyl, was issuing statements in which the agency called on both sides to exercise caution in what was going on. So the word Russia was not mentioned once in the first week or the first 10 days of the offensive and takeover, first of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, and then of site, and then of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. This is despite the fact that the first news that came from Chernobyl in February of 24th and February 25th didn't identify the force that took over the Chernobyl nuclear site. According to the official, to the information, including coming from Ukraine, those were people in unmarked uniforms. So theoretically, it wasn't even any particular country that took over Chernobyl. Those were unknown, maybe terrorist organization. Of course, everyone knew what was going on, but that's how it, at least in terms of the official representation, the knowledge that was there was presented. Why International Atomic Energy Agency was so shy? Again, its voice would become stronger and stronger in the months to come. But the original response is related to a simple fact that the International Atomic Energy Agency is ill-equipped to deal with the situations like that. It is part of the United Nations structure in which Russia and the Russian Federation is the permanent member of the Security Council. I had a conversation with students before that, and there was a question about nuclear. So guys, I'll repeat a little bit for a broader audience what we had discussed, what we discussed before. So the reason is that the International Atomic Energy Agency really depends on the funding coming from Russia. The future and re-election of Mr. Grossi depends on the position of the permanent members of the Security Council, including Russia. His ability to pay members of his team, this and its multi-thousand team in Vienna and in other places, depends on the countries like Russia continuing contribution to the organization. When International Atomic Energy Agency in 1986 signed off on the Soviet version of the accident in Chernobyl, in December of 1986, the Soviet Union paid all its dues for the previous 5 or 6 years that it didn't pay to that organization, in recognition of the cooperation and understanding that was reached with the organization at that time. The situation is even worse than that if you look at the legislative base and the international agreements that exist today, on the basis of which the organizations like IAEA can function or cannot function. The most important document on the war, on the conduct of the war and nuclear power stations comes from the year 1979, in which there is no separate paragraph on the nuclear power stations. They are treated together with the hydroelectric power stations and dikes. And the norm is that it's prohibited to attack that sort of structures in the conditions of the war. But if the other side uses those sites for the military purposes, then the attack on the dike, on the hydroelectric power station and nuclear power station can be justified, which theoretically means that Russians, by taking over the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, don't violate any international agreements, unlike the Budapest Memorandum with the war. There, they don't violate any international agreements because there always an argument can be made that the nuclear power, that the electricity produced by the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is used to light the bulbs in the barracks of the Ukrainian army in this area or in that, and in that sense is used for the military purposes. So when I said that that was for the first time that the war really comes to the nuclear sites in not just in Ukraine, in the world, what that really meant, I didn't realize that when I came up with that formula. What that really meant was that the world in general is not prepared to deal with that at all. At all. Either when it comes to the international agreements or when it comes to the institutions that can deal with the possible accidents. In the last few days, there was a very positive development and very positive signs coming from New York in particular, where Grossi, Guterres met with the Ukrainian Prime Minister and Foreign Minister at that time, and a number of countries, including Canada, signed a document on the creation of the no-fight and no-flight zone over Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. It's a very positive development, but the Ukrainians were asking about that already in early March of 2022, at the very start of the war. And that idea was getting actually no response and no traction either in Vienna or in other capitals. So we will see what will happen next. I'm cautiously optimistic, but I also have serious doubt that Russians actually would agree to first declare and then turn the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant or any nuclear power plant into a no-fight, no-flight zone. And the latest news that are coming from the region was, it seems to me 2 or 3 days ago, a Russian missile ending up a few hundred meters away from the South Ukrainian nuclear power plant in Ukraine. It's north of Mykolaiv. So where does this leave us? What, if anything, can be done about this situation, about the use of the nuclear site as form of the conduct of the war, as form of the blackmail? Where does Vladimir Putin's latest declaration that there will be referendums that will be part of the Russian territory and that Russia is prepared to defend its territory with nuclear power leaves us? Well, we are back in many ways where I started this discussion, at least chronologically. We are very much back in the times of the Cold War, which means that the threat and nuclear threats associated with the Cold War are back. But also what that means is that some of the know-how that allowed the world to avoid the nuclear exchange and nuclear war can be revisited and can be looked again and maybe used for that very same purpose again. For the repetition of the Cold War scenario in which the nuclear war was avoided, it's very important to keep in mind two concepts that had underwritten the nuclear story, nuclear history of the Cold War. One was something that Winston Churchill called already in the mid-1950s after the test of the first hydrogen bomb. He was talking about the balance of terror in Europe. But the balance of terror, it's not just about this side having these nuclear weapons and this nuclear capacities and another has either more or has less. This is also about how this threat is perceived. And at this point, we are in a situation which is very much not like the Cold War one, in which Russia has the capacity, which is not superior, let's say, to the United States or to the combined force of others. But it has a monopoly on the nuclear blackmail. The fear, it has a monopoly on threatening other powers and other countries with use of the nuclear weapons. And what is important in that situation is actually switch and go from the balance of terror to the balance of fear, and state very clearly to Russia and the Russian Federation, much more clear than it has said today, that if Russia uses nuclear weapons, it becomes a legitimate target for the nuclear attack. Because if there is no understanding that the use of the nuclear weapons comes with a response of the same kind, there is no understanding of the sort that there was during the Cold War, we are all at the mercy of the guy with the nuclear bomb that blackmails us. With regard to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and use of the atoms for peace as atoms for war in this kind of conflict. Russia should be let known that whatever happens at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, it is taken over in the hostile way by the Russian armed forces, and the Russian armed forces and the Russia is responsible for what is happening there. There is no similar situation at the Rivne nuclear power plant or other nuclear power plants in Ukraine. There is no bombing, there is no shelling, there is a solely Russian responsibility for that. And if something happens there, Russia should bear full responsibility for that, including its membership as a permanent member of the Security Council in the United Nations. Because that position and that chair was inherited by the Russian Federation, when in reality, according to the law, before 1991, it really belonged to 13 other republics. Ukraine and Belarus were members of the UN in their own right. But 13 others, they shared that common chair, which went to Russia on the right of the imperial succession to the Russian Empire and then to the Soviet Union. And it comes with responsibilities for the non-attacking non-nuclear states. It comes with the responsibilities of not waging the war. It comes with a lot of responsibilities. And until there is a very clear message, both in terms of the use of the nuclear weapons and in terms of the responsibility for any accident, any whatsoever, happening on the nuclear sites occupied by the Russian Federation, I basically see continuation of the situation that we have today. when we're all blackmailed and we don't know what to do and how to respond to that. I wish I could end on a more uplifting note, but at least I tried my best to point into the direction or to show the way forward, at least one of the possible ways. And I want to reiterate that these threats are real and they're not in the past. Future can actually bring even more dangerous situation that we are in today. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will be happy to answer questions if you have any.
There's hands up, but we're using cards. Thanks, everybody. Cards, but there's someone to collect the cards. But first of all, it comes to me to thank Professor Plocki for an incredible talk and providing an enormous amount of context that even, I'm inexpert on Ukraine, but you brought a lot of perspective, particularly when we talked about the 1990s, which is not something that always comes clear when you read the media. It tends to focus on 2014 forward or even more 22, but to bring in the 1990s is exceptional. I have one question for you, but I'm gonna probably do it last because I want you to, I think a lot of questions are gonna be contemporary. I'll take a look, but I'm gonna bring you back to being a historian like me. But we'll do that at the end because I'm as you know, I'm a committed reader of the Financial Times because that's one of our, but I've so enjoyed that lunch you had with the FT. So I want to come back to some of the issues you raised.
And the food was good too.
Yeah, I saw you, if I recall, you were in a is it correct? You were in a Polish restaurant in London. Okay, so first question, the cards are here. Okay, and I've got a lot of questions. We're going to go for about Professor Schatz about half an hour. Does that sound about right? And then we have a reception, as Professor Schatz said, we have books for sale in the corridor and we only have 50 copies. So just keep that in mind. Okay, 50 copies, and Professor Plocki is here to sign them for you. First question, what would be a potential consequences if Ukraine didn't agree to give away nuclear weapons in 1994? Actually, that's something Alex Toshkov and I, who's back there, were talking about, you mentioned that, there were options there, but what would have been the consequences if they said, we're not going to play ball in this circumstance?
Well, I personally believe that they were not in a position to withstand the pressure coming from the two countries at the same time. That was one of the rare cases in the post-Cold War era when the United States and Russia acted together as one front, applying pressure to Ukraine. So you had a global superpower and you had a regional power going against Ukraine. In 93 and 94, when the statehood is not really solidified, the nation is in the process of making, and it's the lowest point in terms of the economic downturn after the end of the Soviet Union. So the option would be going the Northern Korea path, being a pariah in the international community. And I don't think that was the option that would benefit Ukraine. But Ukraine was taking advantage by being forced to sign non-proliferation agreement as non-nuclear state, and then signing the Budapest Memorandum without providing any meaningful guarantees for its safety. It turned out it was really wallpaper. I called Budapest Memorandum wallpaper. That's probably given too much credit to that document. We can look for other ways to characterize it.
Okay, thank you very much. Another big, by the way, almost all the questions are asking that same question. So if you're thinking about a question, don't ask that question, because I've got about 9 questions, the exact same question. What were the options in 1994?
Well, let me see whether I can provide different.
So maybe, okay, I'll keep reading them. To what extent was Putin's foreign policy always irredentist towards Ukraine? And again, that takes us a little bit back, but prior to this, this essay that he wrote last year.
Well, my reading of Putin's foreign policy is that it's really a combination of a number of different visions. The vision is one, restore in one way or another the Russian control over the post-Soviet space. But then the models would be different. The war in 2014 starts over the issue of Ukraine insisting on signing association agreement with European Union. Not membership in the NATO, not membership in the European Union, not candidate member status, association with European Union. Why it was so important for Russia? Because if Ukraine becomes associated or signs this agreement with European Union, it can't become the member of the Eurasian Union that Putin is building. And the Eurasian Union without the second largest part of the former Soviet Union is not a viable project. The Soviet Union, I talked about that, fell in 1991 on the issue of Ukrainian referendum. No other republic had a referendum. And Ukrainians, when they went to vote in December of 1991, they didn't answer the question whether we want the Soviet Union to be around or not. They answered the question whether they supported the decision of their parliament for independence of Ukraine. But Ukraine happened to be the second largest Soviet republic after Russia in terms of population, in terms of the economic potential. The Soviet project without second largest republic, Russia was not interested in it. It was looking for a different way of control of the post-Soviet space. Once Putin is coming back with the idea of the Eurasian Union, again, its success, ultimate success, depends on Ukraine. And union is needed for Putin for the idea of the multipolar world, for Russia emerge as one of the poles on par with European Union and China, rising China in the East. So all of that at the end depends in 2013, 2014 on Ukraine. The union project doesn't work out. He goes for the greater Russia idea, grabs as much territory as possible, tries to disintegrate, destabilize Ukraine, and so on and so forth. So he starts with the idea of union, then he starts with the idea of grabbing as much territory from Ukraine as possible and making the rest of the country incapable of governing itself. So that's geopolitics. But then there is also his fascination with history, and his role in history. There is this anecdote about one of the Russian oppositional journalists, the former editor-in-chief of Echo of Moscow, Echo Moskvy, who was called by Putin at the time when he ended his two tenures as the president and was prime minister at that time. And he asked him what, because that person was a history teacher before that, he said, what out of my 2 terms would actually end up in the history textbook for the high school? And the answer that was given was that, well, maybe the reunification of the Russian Orthodox Church in Russia and Russian Orthodox Church abroad. Putin said, and that's all. And then after Crimea, he met again that gentleman and looked at him and said, and what will now go in the history textbook about Putin? So he is there obsessed with the idea of recreating control over whatever is the definition of Russian lands, and getting down in history. And one thing that I can say, he certainly will go down in history, but certainly not in the way how he imagined.
The way how he imagines. So since you brought up the issue of history, and I'm going to come back to that Financial Times piece where, you know, and again, this is one historian to another. There's a number of historians in the audience. You said that, and I like it because I've used it in a preamble to a class, by the way, but I have noted it was from you, not from me. But you said that, you know, generals nowadays don't just occupy territory. They need to occupy history too. So it's not just about turf, it's about history as well. And you noted that the role of a historian now is to defend your turf. So I'm wondering, given that comment, if you could give us a bit more context about what you meant about that vis-a-vis the narrative that the Russian president uses to justify or rationalize what's going on in contemporary Ukraine now.
Thank you. Really, and probably not just me, I and a number of people whom I knew were felt really ambushed by really Putin's advances first in the field of history with attacks on history, misuse of history. As happened with his pronouncements, he started to talk about Russians and Ukrainians being one and the same people since 2013.
Mm-hmm.
He was together with Patriarch Kirill in Kiev at that time, and that's for the first time he stated that on the they came for made up anniversary 1,500 years of the baptism of Rus. And then July of 2021 article where he presents his historiographic arguments, and you really don't know what to do, because to go out there and engage him and start arguing with him, it's actually providing legitimacy to what he is saying.
Mm-hmm.
Because now we are on par, right? Whatever he says, whatever I say, or whatever historians from the University of Toronto or other place are saying. And the question is how to deal and how to defend your turf.
Mm-hmm.
And the turf, that means the academic standards, the academic standards of the field, the academic standards of the argument, the limitations that come with feeling this responsibility for the field in the world, which is basically a post-truth world, a world of alternative facts. So it's not just Putin, it's generally the situation in which we occur, and the attack under which the social sciences or humanities or knowledge, so-called, the Harvard motto is that they're promoting good knowledge. So somehow they knew whenever they came up with the motto that there was good knowledge and bad knowledge. So how to defend the good knowledge? And again, you look for different ways how to do that, but you really are ambushed at that time. Again, Putin is part of that story, but it's a much broader story, especially in the United States. Canada is a very sane country compared to some of its neighbors.
Well, we've only really got the one, so, but I hear you on that. Now I'm going to give you the question that everyone's going to ask, but no one can answer, but I'm going to give it to you anyway, which is, which takes a kind of pessimistic view on what goes on in Russia. So if Putin in some way or another falls from power, can't we expect a similar figure to replace him in Moscow? By the way, I'm a firm believer, if you're a historian, the only people who can get rid of the president of Russia is in fact the military. And that's from a close reading of the past. So I want your comment.
So you don't trust in the security services?
The security's not as much as I trust the army.
Oh,
but
yeah.
We could talk about it later.
Okay, well, we can. Well, first of all, I agree with you looking at that from the historical perspective, because if you look at the end of the Russian monarchy, if not the end of the Russian Empire, it's the alliance of the military commanders and the Duma deputies that convinced Nikolai II to step down. And then Beria is, of course, arrested by the military. So there are at least two cases in the Russian history / Soviet history where the military, because the perception is that military in Russian history never intervene. They intervened at least twice.
Yeah.
So again, historically, I think that's the very good argument. Now, in terms of Putin and what comes next, again, probably political scientist, or anthropologist, or psychiatrist will give you a different answer. So I'm a historian, and what we see is basically a pattern in particular in the Soviet history and then in the Russian history, but in Soviet in particular. There is after any autocrat of any standing stepping down or dying or being killed or whatever it is, there is a period of relative interregnum in the Soviet history and Russian history that would last at least between 3 and 5 years. So between Lenin's death in 24 and Stalin's rise to power in 29, it's 5 years. Between Stalin's death in 53, rise of Khrushchev to power in 58, 59, so it's another 5 years. For Brezhnev to get to outsmart Kosygin, it took another 5 years to emerge as the sole leader of the Soviet Union in the early 70s. Between Brezhnev and Gorbachev, 3.5 years. What Yeltsin was trying to do, he tried to solve the biggest problem that the Russian politics have. This is a succession problem. Ukraine solved it in 1994, there are elections, that there is a way, there is a mechanism that is legally recognized in the country. Russia never came up with it. Yeltsin was trying to produce one by establishing the successor model, appointing Putin. And Putin made a mockery out of it with poor Medvedev. So the successor model is certainly didn't work at least once, and that raises a lot of questions for the future. But what I certainly expect is that there would be a period at least of 3 or 5 years before the new leader emerges after a figure like Putin. And the scenario, the closest scenario for me is the death of Stalin scenario. Tragicomic, like in the movie, like in the death of Stalin. But generally, it's difficult for me to imagine another person replacing Putin and continuing his policy, because it is so damaging not just to Ukraine and to the world. It's so damaging to Russia and its national interests. So for power is highly personalized today in Russia. So no one will have that amount of the personal power and terror and fear spreading around to conduct that policy after Putin is gone. So I don't buy at all this ideas that we should be very careful, because there is a party of war. There are awful guys behind Putin, much worse than Putin, and we can be careful what you wish. Well, we saw all of these people when there was TV coverage of the Security Council making that decision. We saw what it looks like. That's how authoritarianism looks like. There is no out there.
No out whatsoever.
No one.
I'm going to a degree, keep in historian/academic vein, because I have a question. I'm pretty sure it's from an academic, and by the handwriting, I think it's Alexander Toshko. But Alex, am I right? No, he's got his question still there. Professor Vrubel, is this you? No.
Maybe it's a medical doctor.
It could be a medical doctor, indeed. Can it not be argued that Putin's Russo-centric narrative fit well with considerable parts of academia?
Less so than I would say 20 years ago.
Okay.
But academia, it's in terms of conservatism, it's next only to the Catholic Church. It's because in academia it's generational change, right? It's not the change of paradigm and other things. They come with the change of generations. It's like in autocracy. The policy changes when the ruler is gone, and then the new ruler comes, and then there is an opportunity to rethink that. So as a structure, it is a very conservative institution. And what the academia, again, the academic world, both here in Canada and in the US, are trying to discuss now is the issue of the so-called decolonizing the Russian studies. Again, what that means, it's not clear yet, that there are different approaches, but that's a buzzword that is now out there, and the invitation to think and to suggest and to propose. So maybe we'll get a change even before the generation change. Maybe we will change the paradigm.
Well, I'm encouraging changing the paradigm, but now we're going to bring in something which we haven't. We've talked a lot about nuclear power, both in the civilian use and in the uses for war. But one thing we haven't mentioned too often is the question of oil. So this question is, you alluded to stronger threats from the West could be a deterrent to nuclear proliferation, but such a stance ignores the reality of Europe's depending on Russian oil. Could you elaborate on this dimension of Europe-Russia relations? So it gets us,
yes,
takes
yes,
us right to where we are now.
yes, absolutely. And thank you for this question. The Russo-Ukrainian war produced actually two quite conflicting impulses in terms of what to do with energy, and in particular in Europe. On the one hand, this is the story of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and the possibility of another nuclear accident. The nuclear accidents, they're all local, but their repercussions are global. So it's wherever the next accident happens, the impact will be global. The Fukushima, the biggest impact in terms of the change of energy policy was not in Japan, but in Germany, that decided to go completely nuclear free. So that's one challenge that to the existing policy on the energies. Another one is that the Germany going nuclear free made itself completely dependent on the Russian oil and gas, which was bad from the point of view of the political climate, which was bad and is bad from the point of view of the climate and climate change in general. So how, and again, this is not a unique situation. If there would be simple solutions and just one message, how to balance these two impulses coming out of the war, the danger of the nuclear energy, and then the danger of dependence and over dependence on Russia and Russian oil and Russian gas. Well, the solution is basically very easy. It's what your financial advisors tell you when they try to prepare you for retirement. Diversify, right? So you can't go all the way one way or another. Diversification is a very important factor. Another thing in terms of the nuclear, the big question for me is what to do with the investment into the nuclear into the future. But 440 reactors that exist today, to a degree that they're there, they already did all the climate damage that they could do by mining and producing this and construction and so on and so forth. It's 20% of the electricity in the United States. I'm not sure what it is in Canada. It's 10% worldwide. It's used to be over 50% in Ukraine, 80% electricity production in France. So we can't just shut them down like the Germans did, get hooked on the coal and the Russian gas. So the point is actually have a long-term strategy that would balance different sources of energy. And the lesson is that you can't make sort of mistakes the Germans made and overreact also to nuclear accidents.
Exactly. I've got, as you can see, a lot of questions. We've got a few minutes left. I'm obligated, I think, to take something from the home audience. I've always wanted to say that, by the way. This is the people who are, in Zoom land.
Okay.
But, I'm going to paraphrase, if you work at a university like this, and I'm sure you get lots of calls, and the media is always calling, to get to comment. The big discussion today was, of course, this referenda. And I always reminded people that the Russians don't really care about what we think about their referendums. So, because they don't, it's not being held for us. It's being held for a totally different purpose. But the other big conversation is, of course, and you alluded to it in the talk, is this idea of recruiting an additional 300,000 soldiers. And you also mentioned a much larger figure, which would mean increasing the army to 1 million people, which is possible given the size of the Russian reserve. What do you make of this call up, and what do you make of the response on the ground? Because here in North America, we tend to get excited when 1,000 people show up on the streets, but I don't think 1,000 people, to be frank, matter that much.
People matter even in Russia. And the anti-war mobilization, if it will happen, that will be the key factor for the end of the war. Either it's ended by Putin or without Putin. The news that we are getting today, apparently, that there were also protests in Chechnya, out of all places, and Kadyrov immediately backed and said that, well, Chechnya already fulfilled and over-fulfilled its quota. So there will be, at least publicly, he's saying that there will be no new wave of mobilization on the top of, he presides really over extremely militarized society. So I don't know what that means and whether one should trust him or not. But the situation is that the only force that would be able or capable to stop this war would be some form of discontent, or at least the potential of that discontent in Russia. That is the real threat to Putin's regime. Mm-hmm. It's not NATO. It's not nuclear weapons. From that point of view, Ukraine's democracy presented a much bigger threat to Putin than Ukraine's potential membership in NATO.
Okay.
So the situation is not great. It's not good. But if you think about again, as historians, about the Cold War and the number of people that were in Moscow protesting the Czechoslovakia invasion. But at the end, we saw the Soviet Union imploding from inside.
Yeah.
And I just don't see another scenario with the nuclear superpower called Russia, because a lot of things changed since the end of the Cold War. Russia today is not even one of the 10 largest economies in the world.
Yeah, no,
but there are still 2 nuclear superpowers in the world, mm-hmm. and it's the United States and Russia. Yeah. So that didn't change. So we also have largest, in my understanding, political migration or exile from Russia or live in Russia since revolution and then World War II. Mm-hmm. That's something that will have impact as well. Again, that size of political immigration outside of the borders of Russia, it will have impact on what is happening in Russia as well.
What's happening inside Russia, yeah. Exactly. Yeah. During your talk, you stressed that at least the rhetoric from, let's say, the West should be ramped up a bit. So one of the questions is how far should the West go in terms of threatening a nuclear response to a use of nuclear weapons by Russia? How far do you want to take that?
Well, again, the peace during the Cold War was maintained by the understanding that if you use nuclear weapons, you will get burned,
Mhm.
right? So it's not the nuclear weapons per se that contributed to that long peace after World War II. It's the way how people thought about it and what the use of the nuclear weapons meant.
Right.
So the way of the thinking and understanding that there are actually consequences is extremely important part of not going nuclear today.
Mhm.
What vocabulary should be used, how often, and things like that. I leave that to my colleagues in the government and political science departments. Right. I'm a historian, but again, looking at that from the perspective of the history of the Cold War, that's the technology itself doesn't do these things. What people think about technology or the weapons. Either provoke conflict or keep things from escalate.
Absolutely. So I'm going to conclude the discussion with two questions that I'm going to kind of merge together. And just, I don't know if you know, but this university has done an enormous amount of coverage on Ukraine, and we believe it's one of our fundamental responsibilities is to keep people informed and keep a spotlight on Ukraine. As a person who studied the Balkans and mostly Kosovo, for example, an enormous burden fell to a lot of us, which is so that people didn't forget what happened in Kosovo. Mm-hmm. And the trajectory of Kosovo from 1989 to 99 was a decade, but you had to keep the focus on, you had to keep inviting people from Kosovo here. And I think Canada played a very important role. Mm-hmm. Here we try, I think we do an enormous amount. As you might know, we host a number of students from Ukraine right now. I'm hoping quite a few of them have joined us tonight. I'm not sure, maybe you'll meet some of them at the reception. And as Ed said at the beginning, it's regrettable that we find this, but we're trying to do our best here. So I have these questions. I think one's from an academic and one's from a young historian, and I'll read them both and then we can conclude on that, because I think it's to your point. You said that to refute Putin's historical narrative is to lend him legitimacy. Why is it not the role of the historians to speak truth to power when needed? All right. And then another question, how do young historians nowadays fight against Russian myths, especially about this, so-called brothers history in quotation marks, and win an information war with Russia? Mm-hmm. Nobody has an answer to that, but yeah. And then I'm going to ask you the really hard question, and then we're going to go to the reception. Okay. Good. So what stands between all of us and reception are my answers. I try to keep them really short and brief. Yes. In terms of speaking truth to the power and authority. Yes, that's certainly one of the responsibilities of the academics in general. We are even protected with tenure for those purposes. So the question is basically the format and the way how you're doing that. And at least my solution, and there can be other solutions and probably better or something like that. I am trying to talk about those issues, including the ones raised by Putin, even before they were raised, both through the books, articles, and interviews and things like that. And that's providing good knowledge for the society as a whole. And the second question was. Well, it's kind of young historians, what does a young historian do now to fight an information war and counter a narrative that is grounded in absurdity? Well, one thing that I know people in Ukraine are doing, and historians, not so young maybe, but they still believe they're young, is that Ukraine found itself on the front lines of this disinformation campaign even before Canada and the United States found. So the fact checking and all these things were already on the Ukrainian TV long before the concept arrived in North America, because Russia tried those technologies on Ukraine first. And in Ukraine, there emerged a group that was called Ligbez, so the liquidation of the
anyone can help me, ligbez, illiteracy. Yeah, so in that sense, the historical literacy, where good historians put aside the academic project for a while and went into the trenches of this information war. Again, doing fact checking in terms of history and trying to explain the history of the country, the history of international relations, and so on and so forth. So again, that's one way to deal with that. Another issue there is that again, you all saw me struggling with how to show the image on the screen, and someone helped me. And my guess is that it was a younger person than I am. My students asking me today, can I point them to some video materials and films and so on and so on Ukrainian history, not just on Ukraine. And I'm thinking, okay, maybe this, maybe that, but that kind of material, that kind of content, and that's where especially young historians can do things that maybe the older generations are less prepared or less comfortable in doing those things. So this is the entire new medium that we should be present. And again, I know that there are different opinions about Yuval Harari, but he is writing books, and then he is producing videos, and then he is also doing this kind of visual books. I think that's certainly the future in many ways. The challenge is how to maintain the level of professionalism and the expertise and dedication to the principles of the profession when you go into the broader audience. How not to lose that foundation, because you can get into the trenches of that war and never get out, never get demobilized. So again, that's again one possible way to think about that question. Thank you for that question, and thank you for this reception and for this question. Great question.
So we're going, as you know, we're going to have by the way, just you get to look at that. What we're left with in the front, we have these screens here. I'm looking at the IAEA inspectors,
Yeah.
and they look like they should be working at a car wash. I'm not sure that this is, what I'm hoping. If my hopes depending on that, then I think we're in trouble.
Okay.
But thank you everybody for joining us. As I said, you now have a nice reception for about half an hour. You have some books if you want, and get a chance to talk to Professor Plocki. Professor Plocki, wonderful to have you here. Thank you.